Questions and Answers on Aramaic, brought to you by JesusSpokeAramaic.com. So in this particular question and answer session, we're going to take a look at the question, what is the best translation of the Aramaic New Testament? I get a lot of questions about which translations are available, how do they compare, which one is the best one, and so on. So that's what I'd like to look at in this particular session. So first of all, I don't like the question, how it's phrased there, which is the best one, because it assumes that the answer is, one particular one, that this one is the best and the others aren't as good. And I think that's a bit like asking which is the best restaurant, because you might go to a fantastic Spanish restaurant that you know, an Italian restaurant could be very good as well. One day you might like a Japanese restaurant. They're all different. They have different styles of food. They present differently. Some are informal, some are quick, some are slow. And, getting the best restaurant is a difficult question to answer because it depends what you're looking for out of a restaurant when you go to eat something. And similarly, when you ask the best translation, what do you mean by best? It could mean the most accurate. That would spring to people's mind, which is the most accurate translation. But that's hard to say because what do you mean by accuracy? For example, an interlinear, where you literally have a word-for-word translation, should be extremely accurate, but you need to rephrase the words to make it into a translation, and so that also needs to be borne in mind. Some translations might be a little bit freer, as in rephrasing it to make better sense in English, and so on. So it's a hard question to answer. It also, you find that everyone seems to pick on one particular verse in a particular translation, where somebody has translated it in a way that doesn't suit that person. And there's like one or two examples where it's what they would call a bad translation, and so they reject the whole translation just because of that inappropriate translation. And that's a bit like looking at a dictionary, finding one translation or one explanation of a word that you don't really like, and then saying, oh, this dictionary is no good. We have to be a bit more balanced when we come to translations. Also, translations typically take many years to do, and so it's a lot of work that someone has put into it. So I don't like saying bad things about translations. None of the Aramaic translations, which I'll show you shortly, are, in my view, bad translations. They're all good. I have used them all, I've looked at them all, I've regularly studied them all. There are individual isolated examples where I wouldn't quite have translated a verse that way, or maybe someone's pulling out something that probably isn't warranted from the verse. So given those little warts that all translations might have from time to time, I want to look at these translations as being good quality translations, all coming from slightly different angles, and that's important. But I wouldn't call any single one of them the best, because that implies the others are not good. So all of the translations here, I would say, are good translations. They're generally reliable translations. They're ones which I would recommend. And I haven't done a translation of Aramaic New Testament because, not my own translation, because the ones available are really perfectly good. So let's have a look at some of the ones which are available. First of all, we come to the classic Lamsa Bible. That was one which was done many decades ago, and that was by an Aramaic scholar called George Lamsa, who himself was a reasonably controversial figure. He had some views that many people regarded as unscriptural, and because of him personally, sometimes people don't like the Lamsa Bible because they assume that those views are perhaps carried over into the text. But as a translation, I think it's pretty good. There's an Aramaic Old Testament and a New Testament together, which again is extremely useful. So as you're reading through the Aramaic Old Testament translation here, in your mind you're comparing it to the Hebrew Bible and also translations of the Hebrew Bible that you might be familiar with, such as the King James or the Jewish Publication Society or something along those lines. So typically, when you're reading this, if something stands out as being different to the way that you remember it, typically that's good. That's an indication that you want to perhaps check into the text to look into why there might be a difference there. It could be that there's a Hebrew word that's difficult, and so an Aramaic translation has translated it differently. It could mean there's slightly different names, or maybe a slightly different translation in the Peshitta Old Testament. So often these differences are actually really interesting. That's when it highlights that there's something that's worth looking into. There's also a very good introduction in the Lamsa Bible that points out some verses where the Peshitta is potentially, interesting from a point of view of comparing it to the Hebrew text. Also, the New Testament translation in the Lamsa Bible is again, generally a good translation of the New Testament. So the Lamsa Bible is a nice volume. It's well presented, and it's something that you really should have on your bookcase, just as a reference work, if nothing else. Then we come to another whole series of translations, one way or the other, which Reverend David Boucher has brought together, and these again are highly recommended. These are very good. David Boucher has done a lot of very good work into the Aramaic New Testament. There's all sorts of codes and evidence that he presents showing how a lot of the text is original text. It can only have come from a source that falls outside of the Greek New Testament, for example, as opposed to simply being a translation of it. But those are examples which are given there. Lots of the words of Jesus, for example. And then this series of volumes comes in, for example, the New Testament only. He is starting to work through the various Old Testaments, such as the Psalms and Proverbs, to form the Aramaic Old Testament translation as well, in much the same way as the Lamsa Bible also had a translation of both the Old and New Testaments. These are generally very good works, which I would also like. I use them myself. Then there is the Aramaic English New Testament by Andrew Gabriel Roth, and that also is a really good reference work. The translation itself is good. It's from a sort of Jewish perspective, so that gives a slightly different insight into the text. There's also a very comprehensive range of footnotes here, where a lot of the sort of Jewish background to the New Testament, which might not be known to a lot of English speakers, is brought in. And that also is really, really interesting sometimes to see those footnotes. There's also a whole reference section at the back with lots and lots of appendices covering lots of different subjects, and those are also very interesting reading. So the Aramaic English New Testament is a very, very good edition. I think it's up to about the 5th edition now, something that's highly recommended. It has the English text on the left-hand side of the page and the corresponding Aramaic text in Ashuri letters on the right-hand side of the page. So you can compare the two and start to get into the Aramaic text and so on. But the fact that it's got footnotes, in many ways, the footnotes in a Bible are actually the best part of it, because those are bringing out points where a translation itself might not be able to bring points out fully. So I like footnotes in an edition of the Bible, because often they bring out aspects of the text which you wouldn't otherwise be aware of just from the translation alone. Translations are a kind of take it or leave it, but once you get into footnotes and understand what comments the author's making and why he translated it in a certain way, then that's really good. You start to get more insights into the text. So the AENT, Aramaic English New Testament, is a very, very good one. Then there's another whole series of workbooks related to Aramaic by Janet Majira, and she also is an excellent scholar of Aramaic. Actually, in the early 2000s, when her Aramaic New Testament database came into BibleWorks, it was actually primarily through that I started to really learn Aramaic extremely intensively. I went through in BibleWorks every word, every phrase, every entry in the lexicon and so on through Janet Majira's work in BibleWorks, and that's what really lifted up my knowledge of Aramaic immensely. It was much easier to do that than to try to piece it together through grammars and so on. So here there's the Aramaic Peshitta New Testament translation, but this is one of a series of works which Janet Majira has put together. So for example, there's also an interlinear, there's a whole series of lexicons and so on, and those interrelate. So this as a translation, it's not in isolation, you can buy it in conjunction with many other works. Also, I would point out that again, the footnotes and some of the introductory material is actually the best part of it. As a translation, it's a good kind of literal translation, just exactly what the text is saying, with very little interpretation, and that's a good thing. But also the introductory material and some of the idioms which it brings out, those are also very, very good. It's often the idioms that we get an insight into the things that Jesus said, which we wouldn't otherwise be aware of if we didn't know those idioms. So this again is a really excellent work, in addition to all the other material which is also presented in various books and so on. There's also a different variant of that, which is a Messianic edition, and that again sort of kind of is fairly obvious, the different angle, let's say, it's taking, and those other Messianic version of it is going to be useful for certain circles, but obviously even if you're not in the Messianic circles, it's still interesting to know maybe a slightly different perspective on the way you would look at things that you might not otherwise be aware of. So again, these volumes are recommended. I really have learned a lot from them. There's also an older translation now, from going back to 1852, was Murdoch's translation of the New Testament. This is a good standard translation in English. It is slightly antiquated English now, coming from the Victorian era, but nevertheless it still has stood the test of time. It's a good translation. There are some individual words that maybe we wouldn't quite use nowadays, but in general it's a good, solid translation. This was actually the translation which I chose to put onto the website, and so if you go to the website, jesusspokearamaic.com, under Shop and Bible Versions, you'll see this is something which you can buy in paperback format at a nice cheap sort of cost for people. So again, Murdoch is a really solid translation of the Aramaic New Testament, and one which is used by a lot of people. I didn't do my own translation of the New Testament in Aramaic, simply because what would be the point? There's other ones out there which are perfectly valid and actually very good. So Murdoch's translation is one that's available from the website, jesusspokearamaic.com, and it's generally reliable, it's stood the test of time, and so on. And again, the material at the back, appendices and so on, often they are actually the best part of any translation. There are also a number of older translations, more or less at exactly the same time as the Murdoch translation, which we've just seen. So those are the Etheridge translation of 1849, Dr. John Etheridge, and also William Norton's translation from 1851. So those are two other translations of the Aramaic New Testament, parallel to Murdoch's translation, almost exactly the same sort of time period in the Victorian times. So that shows you, that highlights to you, just how important the Syriac was, the Aramaic New Testament, in Victorian times, round about the 1850s. There was a whole burst of activity which brought to light just how important those works were. The Aramaic New Testament had 3 translations, and remembering publishing a book in those days was not like nowadays, where you can just spin something out in a word processor and put it on Amazon. It's a lot of work. You had to have a publisher, there had to be an audience, it had to have known financial backing. So in other words, this indicates that there was a lot of interest in Aramaic at the time, and to have 3 separate independent translations of a book, of a New Testament, to the 1800s just shows how intense interest there was at the time. This shows how Aramaic down through the centuries has always been in the forefront of people's minds. It's really only in the last 50 or so years that the Aramaic New Testament, the Syriac, has started to take a lesser interest amongst academic circles, for the simple reason, mostly, that there's nothing you can really do with the Aramaic New Testament. There are hardly any variants of any concern, and so academics, there's no way to get MScs and PhDs out of it all by studying it all, because it's one fixed text, and there's no scope for getting degrees on textual criticism and things like that. So the academic world has abandoned the Aramaic New Testament because it's no longer based on faith and what was handed down through the centuries by Bible believers. It's all nowadays based on how to get a PhD, how to remain in academia, and so all the work is on, for example, Greek, because that's where you can start coming out with new theories of textual criticisms and have a text that's ever evolving in academia. So that compares some of the major translations of the Aramaic New Testament. They're all recommended for different reasons. They're all good. They're all thorough introductions. Many people use the Lamsa Bible, and that's generally a good translation. So let's just come to a few conclusions. As I've said, all of these are good, reliable translations in general. I wouldn't say any of them is the best translation, because that's a really hard question to answer, because it depends what do you mean by the word best, and that's that everyone will have a different answer to that question. So they all have their merits. They're all reliable in general. They're all good. I've personally used them all and like them all. But sometimes, actually, the footnotes in a translation are the thing that really makes it worthwhile. The footnotes are the things that highlight interesting things in the text that are worth studying, and also the footnotes highlight things where the translator found it difficult to find perhaps an English word that captures things correctly. Often they have introductory material, which is very, very interesting indeed, and often they have appendices and things at the back of the New Testament translation, or the Aramaic translation, which itself lends extra information which is worth reading. So sometimes just the translation isn't the interesting bit. It's sometimes all the other material around it that brings an interest into the Aramaic text that actually is the most interesting bit of all. And all of those different works, they're all done independently, and that means they all have different appendices, different forward material, different idioms which they bring out. So all of them together have their merits, and I wouldn't say that there's one single one that is absolutely the best. They're all good. It's a bit like choosing the best restaurant where, on different days they're all good for different reasons. So I hope that's been an introduction to the question of what is the best Aramaic New Testament. At least we've seen what the possibilities are, which ones are out there from different time scales and so on, different centuries. And it's really a matter of looking at them all, finding one that suits you, and perhaps broadening out and getting one new translation a year and reading through that as you go through the yearly reading cycles, and just generally being aware of the differences between the Aramaic text and other traditions. So thank you for listening, and hopefully that's been good. We'll cover more questions another time. This question and answer session was brought to you by JesusSpokeAramaic.com. To submit your question for consideration in a future session, fill out the form at JesusSpokeAramaic.com/contact. Be sure to visit JesusSpokeAramaic.com for step-by-step video lessons on the history and background of Aramaic, to learn the Aramaic alphabet in the Ashuri, Estrangela and Serta scripts, for biblical Aramaic, the Aramaic Peshitta New Testament, the Aramaic Old Testament, and the Aramaic Targums. We offer a growing range of Aramaic DVDs, workbooks, study guides, and meditational CDs on well-known passages of the Bible, books about Aramaic, a range of specialist Hebrew and Aramaic Bibles, and generally everything you need to study Aramaic in the context of the Holy Scriptures. JesusSpokeAramaic.com is a one-stop shop when it comes to learning Aramaic. Subscribe to get full access to the complete range of several hundred step-by-step video lessons, exclusive bonus material, and other resources that are available only to subscribers of JesusSpokeAramaic.com.